So I think it goes without saying that porn addiction and lust are a huge problem in the church today. And it's not to say that it isn't a big problem outside of the church, just that we recognize it as a problem and we want to address it, obviously, which is why simultaneously there's also a lot of solutions and advice about how to address it. And while some of it's extremely good, a lot of it isn't helpful or can even be harmful. So forgive me if this is just adding one more advice column to this whole question, but what I want to share is grounded in what I think is a more traditional understanding of the human person that modern culture neglects and seems to be less familiar with, at least to most people. So in my view, it brings a depth of wisdom that has been missing from this conversation in too many places and for far too long. I should also point out that a lot of the practical advice in this video is more directed towards men, because while this isn't only a problem for men, while I'm relying on the collected wisdom of the church and scripture, I'm also drawing from my own experience of applying these principles to my own life. So I expect it needs to be adapted a bit for women. So take what I have to say with a grain of salt or with that specific grain of salt and see if you can adapt it to your particular situation. Okay, so with all of that said, I think the place to start here is by understanding what's going on. How does this vice grow and appear and start to dominate us? So we have to understand that as a human being, you have certain faculties and powers, which include sensory appetites, which incline you towards certain things like nutrition, and which also include your passions, or what we might call like our emotions. And these are generally good insofar as they direct you towards things like food and safety and relationships. But they should never be given full autonomy over your life. You should never be merely following your appetites and passions just blindly. They can propose objectives to you, but then your intellect should evaluate those proposals and determine if they are actually good for you. So, for example, I may have had a full meal at dinner time, but now I have a craving for a whole bag of chips and a time to veg out in front of the TV. Is that actually a good idea, or is that an unhealthy way to live my life? My intellect should decide, and then it should direct my will, which is my rational appetite, to follow through with an appropriate action. In this case, to avoid the cupboard full of chips. The next thing to understand is that whatever you and I do repeatedly reinforces that thing. This is where we get the idea of habits from. Habits are behaviors that have become like second nature because we've been trained by the repetition of them. We do them without even thinking at that point a lot of the time, which if we've trained ourselves in good habits, then that means that they become virtues. But if we've trained ourselves in bad habits, then they become vices. For example, if I devoted hours of every day to just bouncing a basketball, well, then I'd get really, really good at it. At first, I'd have to kind of clumsily concentrate on what I was doing because it would be foreign to my habits. But eventually, the habit, the muscle memory, and the skill would develop to the point where I wouldn't have to think about it. It would just be second nature to me. And if I were to do that, it would actually change who I am. It would rewire my brain. It would create abilities that I didn't previously have. I'd go from someone who can bounce a basketball moderately if I'm paying attention to what I'm doing to someone who can just do it proficiently without even trying. The point being, what you do repeatedly strengthens that habit. And vices are the same thing. They follow the same principle. So if I always get a big slice of cake after every meal, I'll reinforce and strengthen that appetite, the appetite that wants that cake, to the point where it will become difficult to say no once it appears. This becomes that much more dangerous with something that is addictive. So in the case of someone addicted to pornography and lust, what's happened is your will has repeatedly and habitually surrendered to your appetite and your passions of desire, specifically for sex, which has strengthened then the appetite to like an absurd degree and weakened the will to the point where it can't govern that appetite anymore, which is its purpose, which means that your appetite has now become an adversary, which now seeks something that is destructive to you. And furthermore, if you're a person of faith, you should know that your true adversary is the devil, who is going to exploit your animalistic appetite against the good of your soul, which will continually be a losing battle. So your intellect recognizes the destructive nature of this sin and this vice, and so it tries to direct your will to resist it, but your will is incapable of doing so because the appetite has grown inordinately by the repetition of surrender to it. That's the situation. So based on that, what's the remedy? I think it starts by recognizing that this is a spiritual battle, and you need to have a battle plan. You need to treat this unruly appetite and the one who exploits it against you as actual enemies, with an appreciation that your enemy is stronger in this case than you are. In a straight fight, you will lose every time. So you have basically two options: attack your enemy where it is weak, and number two, strengthen yourself where you are weak, in this case, your will. But before you even begin to wage war with your enemy, out of an appreciation for the fact that you are outmatched and outnumbered, your best policy should be to retreat. Run away. Be a coward with respect to this enemy. If you know going into a battle that you'll lose, then pushing forward or even courting conflict, that isn't courage, it's foolhardiness. So the very moment you think that temptation is rearing its ugly head, close your eyes, run away, and profess your love for Jesus. But it isn't just about running away, it's about never having to run away. Don't get entangled in the first place by avoiding all avenues of contact. And let's be painfully obvious here, because we have to. Your mobile phone is the biggest gateway to what triggers this appetite. And no half measure is going to work in this case. If you repeatedly find yourself scrolling on, Instagram or social media only to have this appetite awakened, then by the time you try to resist, it's already too late. Now, most of us unfortunately can't live without these things in a world that requires you to be constantly connected. Just the other day, I needed roadside assistance because I had locked my keys in my car, and I had to download the app just to request a tow truck to come out. But we can take a fast to avoid this adversary, this enemy, while we kind of regroup and strategize. So what if you resolve to block your phone for a month and just use a flip phone or something like that? What if you take an internet fast from everything except for work? And then after that, be vigilant with filtering software and accountability apps like Covenant Eyes or Clean Browsing or Canopy, just to name a few. And I know that to some people that will seem extreme and maybe even unnecessary, but this is not something to be indifferent about. This has eternal consequences to it. If you're habitually committing this sin, you've lost control, and these are the extremes you have to take to recover your wits and your willpower. You need to interrupt the cycle with some kind of serious intervention. So start by understanding what triggers your enemy to reveal himself and avoid those triggers at all costs, at least for a period of time. This should be non-negotiable as a first step. Okay, so before I explain more of the practical advice, we also have to appreciate the role of prayer here. God's grace is like a cheat code that will level you up for whatever confrontations you might face. But you have to avail yourself to it. If you're an apostolic Christian, this means receiving the sacraments, going to confession regularly, at least monthly, and receiving the Eucharist as often as possible. This also means a daily habit of personal prayer. You need to be praying morning and night with whatever realistic devotions you can then fit in between those times. Something like an Angelus at lunchtime is a great idea, scripture reading, and of course, the rosary is an indispensable tool here. But prayer alone isn't enough, especially if you're doing everything else wrong. Grace builds upon nature, which means that you have to have some natural virtue and vitality for God to strengthen and build upon. It might also be true that God is withholding certain graces and allowing you to fall into this sin because of a larger issue which needs to be addressed, which, if that's what's going on, the larger problem is pride. Because pride is much more dangerous as a sin than lust is, and the devil would gladly let you prevail over lust and even persevere in temperance if he can secure your soul through pride. Because pride is what makes you a rival and a belligerent against God and his grace. So God obviously won't allow that to happen. He lets you fall into this sin because the effect is shame, which inflicts damage on pride. And contrary to popular conventional modern belief, shame is actually a good thing. It's a consequence that God has baked into the moral life, which is meant to discourage you from sinning in this way. And I know that some people will claim that shame is actually counterproductive because it prevents us from asking for help or repenting if we need to. But that isn't shame. That's pride. The shame discourages you from sin. Pride discourages you from making amends. So don't blame shame for your pride. Shame is a good emotion meant to help. So if you want to best predispose yourself to the grace God can give you, but seems to be withholding in spite of your prayerfulness and your good intentions, then it's likely you have a problem with pride and need to grow in humility. So the practice of humility then becomes a prerequisite and an essential one. God won't let you advance in temperance if it'll only fuel your pride. So he will allow you to fall into lust if it will contribute to your humility. So one thing that is really important to remember is not to get angry at God if your prayers for temperance and self-control seem to go unanswered. There's a reason, and it's because you're skipping a step. Okay, so that's the supernatural dimension. Let's go back to the natural and what we described as the battle plan. So you need to strengthen your will while weakening your appetite. So how best do you weaken your appetite? The answer is through mortification, that ancient practice of the Christian church that the modern world has denounced as a kind of self-hatred and enemy of freedom. But look at what the exercise of the kind of false freedom of the modern world has gotten us. Slavery to our appetites, where we are assailed with greed, obesity, and in this case, lust. So in order to mortify this appetite, which is called the concupiscible appetite, it helps to know that it relates to all pleasant sensory goods, which also includes food. So while your desire for lust may have grown too formidable, you can still attack that appetite by fasting from food, assuming you still have a fighting chance in that dimension of your life. So the most obvious thing to do here is to practice fasting. The church obviously assigns certain days for fasting, but nothing is stopping you from practicing it on other days as well. So begin to habitually mortify your appetite for food, which will simultaneously strengthen your will, but also weaken your appetite's ability to rebel against your intellect and your will. One suggestion that I've commonly seen given by theologians and philosophers is to avoid eating and drinking to satiety, which means call it quits while you still feel like you could eat a little bit more. Always leave yourself slightly unsatisfied, which is another way of habitually placing this appetite under the authority of your will. Other ways to mortify your appetite and flesh while strengthening your will can include any opportunity for self-denial and the moderation of sensory pleasure. You could try sleeping on the floor. Physical exercise obviously is a good. Cold showers, hair shirts traditionally, or any sort of uncomfortable clothing, or just whatever you can come up with. You can be creative, but don't discount the tried and the true. They are common for a reason. Now, the last thing to appreciate is the role of consequences. Negative consequences are one of our strongest motivators to avoid sin and evil. And part of the problem with pornography is that it can feel like a victimless crime, especially if it's kept secret. So it's important to reaffirm the serious consequences that are, in fact, inherent within it. The obvious one, or it should be obvious to us, is the loss of your freedom. The more you become a slave to your appetites, the more you diminish what makes you uniquely human. We all want freedom. We all want to be able to choose whatever we recognize as good. But if your appetite grows unruly, then we will find ourselves enslaved by our worst instincts. And for the same reason we can attack lust through our appetite for food, if we let it continue to dominate us, it will eventually take over in those areas of our lives as well. So we may soon find ourselves struggling with things like obesity or drunkenness and other forms of intemperance. The next thing to know is that this will, not might, it will seriously damage your ability to enjoy healthy conjugal relations in your marriage. It will create doubts and distrust, and it is even commonly reported as a contributor to actual medical dysfunction that prevents sexual intimacy. Now, I feel like there's a lot that could be said about this, but I'm a firm believer that a happy and healthy physical relationship in marriage depends on a kind of light-hearted and even playful approach. If you overthink it, if you bring all kinds of anxieties and baggage and severity to the marriage bed, you're going to have problems, and addictions and vice will certainly manifest that kind of dysfunction and prevent the kind of almost cavalier weightlessness that makes it easy for couples to enjoy intimacy. A legacy of pornography will rob you and your spouse of that kind of liberality. And to whatever degree you can construct a system of consequences for yourself, I would say the better. Go to the same confessor. Don't bounce around. Use accountability features in any software that you employ. Find trusted friends you can talk to about it, and employ specific forms of mortification when you fall and when you fail. For example, make yourself have a cold shower at the next opportunity immediately after. Sleep on the floor that night, or abstain from other forms of comfort and pleasure. Lastly, your motivations play a huge role in achieving freedom and chastity. If your main motivation is to count yourself among the strong and the self-disciplined, the kinds of people you admire on social media, you're going to struggle. If your motivation is to avoid the consequences of shame and discomfort, you're going to struggle. If your motivation is to grow in humility and most of all love for God and neighbor, that's when you will find success. Don't fixate on yourself. Fixate on God and your spouse or your future spouse, and out of love for them, do whatever you can to avoid this extremely pernicious vice. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support. So if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca, or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.